relationship, whilst highlighting intelligence and nuclear weapons as factors that are more important to this relationship.
So you've seen life both as an historian, as an author, and as a politician. Having read the book by Guy Arnold, himself quite a distinguished author, but I don't think his bibliography is quite as long as yours, what did you make of his book?
Well, this is a book that purports to analyse the special relationship. And so the first issue is, what is the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States? And he seems to take the view that this is all about foreign policy. And of course it's true that our two countries will have policy goals that are more or less the same. But very often they'll diverge. And what he tends to do is to concentrate on that divergence. For my money, the special relationship is about this unique link between our two countries. Not language, not history, not culture. It's about intelligence, the exchange and collection of intelligence, and it's about nuclear weapons. It's the sharing of nuclear technology. And that makes us absolutely unique. The Americans gave nuclear technology to the French. They share foreign policy goals, sometimes, with plenty of other countries. But the special relationship is the Anglo-American relationship, and that is absolutely unique, irrespective of what the politicians or the civil servants do to upset it.
If you start off, say, with the Suez crisis, which was a major parting of the waves between British foreign policy and American foreign policy, an absolute humiliation for the British Prime Minister Eden, who ended up resigning, dying of ill health as a result of all this pressure. I doubt the exchanges could have been terribly good then, were they?
Well, they weren't, but I would say that it predates it. I think in order to understand the special relationship and what went wrong with Suez is, first of all, you have to see the cryptographic exchange during the Second World War. It's not generally understood, but the U-boat war in the North Atlantic was largely fought in Washington, D.C. The cryptography was conducted in Nebraska Avenue, and the solutions, the daily solutions to the U-boat cipher systems sent to Bletchley Park on a daily basis. So the United States, the United Kingdom, had this absolute total bond dating back to 1945. 1947, things go wrong over the independence of India. And there were plenty of people who took the view that the Americans were anti-colonialists. Then we get to 1956. And of course it's true that this was an adventure based on intelligence. This was the belief by Anthony Eden, on information supplied by the Secret Intelligence Service, that Lucky Break, a very important source within the Egyptian military, had disclosed that Egypt was going to become part of the Soviet bloc and had acquired this huge purchase of weapons for one purpose only, obviously to attack Israel. And that was the end of Anthony Nutting's career. That was the end of Anthony Eden's career. But do not forget that in retrospect, Richard Nixon said that the American decision to pull the rug from under that British Expeditionary Force in Egypt was the worst foreign policy decision of the Eisenhower administration.
The Americans were a bit slow over the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands Islands, or Malvinas, as they called them, because although America subsequently decided to weigh in behind Britain's position, that wasn't their position at the outset, was it? They were trying to appease their friends in South America and try and stop the Brits becoming too upset about it all. They were trying to sit on the fence a bit during that period.
Well, I wouldn't say that they sat on the fence. I would say that the initial reaction was pro-Argentinian. And you remember that Jean Kirkpatrick was the ambassador at the United Nations, and she was wholly in favor of the Monroe Doctrine. Her view was that this was nothing whatever to do with the United Kingdom. And that instinctively was the view of Al Haig, and it wasn't until he went down to Buenos Aires and met General Galtieri, who was plastered at 9 o'clock in the morning, that he realized that this was a complete nonsense. And ultimately, the Americans were enormously helpful to us. They supplied us with the sat phone systems, the communication systems that we'd never even seen.
We caught up with the author Guy Arnold to give us his insight into this transatlantic alliance, what he thinks of this bond, and how strong it actually is.
Guy Arnold, thank you for joining us on the Chronicles. We're going to talk a little bit about your book and the views you express in it. But before we do that, could you just tell our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been a freelancer for a very long time. I got involved curiously in Africa. I became temporarily part of the Peace Corps Internationals, the Americans called it at that time. And I went to northern Rhodesia just on the year before independence.
There were a lot of stresses in the relationship between Mrs. Thatcher and American foreign policy on things like the invasion of Grenada, where I remember the Queen was particularly angry because American forces invaded British overseas territory. That Grenada period, which you deal with in your book, that was a pretty heavy time for relationship between the two countries.
That was a bad time for relationship, but it's interesting that Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was the Foreign Secretary then, and he'd been left giving a speech in Parliament saying that the Americans are not going to invade, and 24 hours later they had. His objections to the Americans were overruled by Thatcher, who in essence says it doesn't matter what they've done, we've got to stick by the special relationship. Worse came in 1986 with the bombing of Libya.
Yeah.
The Americans wanted to take out Gaddafi, and they asked the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese to give them overflying rights, and they all said no. So they then had to fly their planes from Britain down to Gibraltar, then along the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
In a press interview afterwards, I think it was Rear Admiral Carroll, who is responsible for the American military in Britain. He was asked the question, what would you have done if the British said, no, you can't use those planes? What was your scenario? And he said, our scenario was to do it anyway, and then talk to the British. And this was a chilling answer. It just showed how contemptuous the Americans were, in fact, to the British.
And a very unpopular time for the British government then. I remember public opinion was very much against the use of the Air Force bases in Norfolk for the bombing of Libya, and the press were very hostile. So it wasn't a vote winner for Mrs. Thatcher back home, as it were.
No, it wasn't. But she had given a speech 3 months before the Libyan business in which she actually said, we do not believe in interfering in the country unless they've gone to war with us, or something like that.
Many believe that during the Falklands or Malvinas War in the 1980s, Britain's relationship with the US changed. This relationship is not simply viewed primarily through the personal relationships of prime ministers and presidents, but also in relation to the powerful North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
When relations between Mrs. Thatcher and President Bush got very strained was during the Falklands, the early stages of the Falklands War, when Argentina obviously invaded the Malvinas, as they refer to them, the Falklands as the British do, and America was sort of trying to sit on the fence, really. It didn't want to upset its neighbors in Latin America, but it didn't want to upset its allies, the Brits in NATO. So America was in a really quite a difficult position during that period.
It was an interesting situation there, because the Americans, as you say quite rightly, their number one concern in theory was their relations with Latin America, which included Argentina and Brazil, the biggest of the lot. At the same time, we were an ally in NATO, and we claimed, and the Americans sometimes agreed, that we were their most important ally. And there was a real split, I think, in the American hierarchy, the State Department and so on, as to who to support. And in the end, the argument that won the day was we must show to the world at large that we stick by our major allies.
As well as dealing with the sort of relationship between presidents and prime ministers and all that, you spent a good while talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which makes sense in a book about the relationship, because that has been pivotal since its creation in both the political element of NATO, which not many people understand, and the military side of NATO, which is more obvious, I think, to many. Is it your conclusion that America's really dominated NATO and that everybody else basically does what America wants as far as NATO is concerned?
I think it's more than that. I mean, NATO was quite clearly created to deal with what we saw as a Russian communist threat. And when you come to 1992 and the end of the Cold War, In my view, we should have abolished NATO at once because it had finished, it passed its sell-by date. Instead of which, not only did we not do this, but under American pressure, we pushed it up to the borders of Russia. And that explains part of the attitude which exists now about Russia and Ukraine and so on. We're resurrecting an old Cold War stance. But in my view, the Americans kept NATO going because as long as they kept NATO going, they could dominate Europe. And one of the underlying fears that keeps coming through in my book, or I try to bring it through in my book, is the fact that the Americans didn't want Europe to go its own way. They wanted it to be under their control. And the best way to keep it under their control was to have to maintain NATO after the end of the Cold War.
And interestingly, NATO evolved from being a defensive organization for most of its life, where it wouldn't respond unless invaded or attacked, and attack one, you attack all theory. But then it changed to being a more aggressive military organization, and of course participated in Afghanistan. What did you make of that change from being defensive to aggressive?
If they're going to persuade Europe to keep NATO, they had to give NATO something to do.
Yeah.
And from their point of view, getting NATO involved in Afghanistan was involving Europe in an American problem. You may have seen a little time ago, was it Gates, the American security man, had a book out. And he gave an interview in which he said it was just the time when our government was cutting the military budget and so on. And he said, if you cut your budget much longer, you're no use to us. He gave the whole game away. What they want is British mercenaries to be called in where they're having a contretemps with somebody else.
Some believe that the special relationship is based on intelligence sharing between Britain and the US. Many argue that the British and American intelligence and security services only sometimes share information. Others, however, believe the respective intelligence departments are deeply embedded.
What would it have done, do you think, for the so-called special relationship if Haig hadn't changed his mind, if the State Department hadn't rowed back from their position on the invasion of the Falklands? If America had continued to vacillate and Britain had gone on to defeat Galtieri's forces, would that have been the end of the special relationship?
I think it would have been very severely damaging, because the corollary of what you're suggesting is that the Thatcher administration would have collapsed. A task force being sent down to the South Atlantic, even with that American support, Sidewinder missiles, NATO fuel on Ascension, in spite of all of that, it was actually a very close-run thing. Another week or so, and we would have had to go home. Midwinter, we couldn't have supported the task force there. So that would have been a humiliation. And if we'd lost just one capital ship, Invincible or Hermes, that would have been the end of the story.
And the infamous Thatcher, too.
I believe that if the task force had come home having been defeated, and their only option, a little bit like D-Day in 1944, to say, well, we'll try again next year in the invasion season, that would have been the end of the government.
Yeah. How closely do the security services work? Do we really know how closely they work?
The security and intelligence agencies work literally hand in glove. These are relationships that have been built up over a very long period, that you will get joint operations being conducted constantly that never reach the headlines. I mean, why do you think Colonel Gaddafi collapsed and agreed in 2003 to inspection of all his sites? It was because a CIA officer and his British counterpart, an SIS officer, went there, having interdicted a ship called the BBC China that was interdicted in Italy, full of nuclear material destined for Libya. And it was very straightforward. The threat to Gaddafi was, we're about to go into Iraq and you're next. And he folded. Now that has received no great publicity, but it did receive knighthoods for all concerned. And that was a really good example of a joint operation based on the surveillance conducted by SIS and the CIA of A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani nuclear proliferationist. So that kind of joint operation builds trust between the two organizations.
But in your opinion, it's embedded rather than just it's time to time, it's mutually convenient. It's a real organization.
It is completely embedded. If you were to walk into the Joint Terrorism Threat Analysis Center, which is a joint MI5 SIS operation based in Thames House, you will find American voices there. And if you were to say, well, that's very strange, you're carrying a British card that gives you access to the Holy of Holies, he will say, I'm an FBI special agent on attachment from New York. Not temporarily, I have a tour of duty here for 3 years.
Yeah. So does that go on even when there are the sort of tensions that we get from time to time between the two nations in terms of what their best perceived self-interest is? The security services, they get on with it, regardless of how the politicians are arguing or regardless of how the Foreign Office or the State Department are arguing. These secret agents are still doing their business.
I think the best example is in the old days, on Thursday mornings, there would be cabinet at 10 Downing Street, start at 9 o'clock in the morning, chaired by the Prime Minister. The much more interesting meeting was being held further down the road, which was the Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired by a professional, the heads of all the various different agencies being present, plus the permanent secretaries of the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and the Treasury. And guess who sits ex officio at those JIC meetings, which discusses the priorities for the following week, signs off on the Red Book, which goes to some members of Cabinet? Yes, it's the CIA station chief in London.
So in terms of the American relationship with the United Kingdom, who else would you think, given your expertise, they'd be closest to? Would it be Israeli intelligence? Would it be Mossad?
No.
After the Brits, or not in the same
Canada,
level?
Australia,
Canada, yeah.
And New Zealand. And then beyond that, there is a very big jump, and we can provide the evidence for that. There is KZAB, which is or was the forum for the exchange of the most sensitive counterintelligence information. There will be other exchanges, the Bern Club, Kilowatt, where there are committees from other countries, including the Israelis, to deal with specific issues like terrorism or particularly Palestinian terrorism. But those are side issues. The only real relationship are the Five Eyes: Britain, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada.
So you would think, from Guy Arnold's book, was there ever a special relationship? You think, certainly as far as the intelligence services are concerned, there definitely was. Is.
There was, there is, and it will continue despite the civil servants, despite the State Department, despite occasional politicians who will come and go.
The so-called special relationship is something that America particularly have perhaps tried to break free from as they search for new allies in Europe and across the world.
So maybe the US-UK special relationship, there's a lot of shared values going on in that. I think it was just fairly uncontentious to say that. But that doesn't apply with most of America's other friendly faces, does it? I mean,
well,
they're not democracies.
One of the arguments that runs through my book, I think, is the fact that when Britain was pushing the idea of the special relationship, the Americans counter-thrust said, yes, but we have relations with Germany, we have relations with France. And through much of that period, the Americans wanted France and Germany and the European Union to succeed. They were less happy at it succeeding when they come to the present time, because it has the capacity to be a new superpower, and they don't like that at all. But I mean, as far as Britain was concerned, when Obama came to power, he gave a speech in which he talked about I like to have good relations with everybody. He was downsizing the special relationship. And people in the Foreign Office said, this is really pretty bad, we can't have him doing it. And they had to do some rethinking about how we approach America under Obama with the special relationship.
And in terms of this sort of poodle-like relationship, not wishing to offend that wonderful breed of dog, but there's sort of America barks and we trying to yap at its heels alongside. Do you see a lot of that in the relationship between America and Iran and Britain and Iran, where America's obviously taken a very aggressive stance towards Iran since the fall of the Shah, and as has Britain. And it can't be about religious extremism, which is what the Americans often say, because their friend Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, are a very extreme form of the Sunni faith. So it can't be about that. So what is it that drives American attitude
I
into
think
particular
the Americans have still not forgiven Iran for 1979 and the hostages. They're deeply humiliated by that.
And is that also because of, say, the impact of the very powerful Israeli lobby in Washington?
Oh, yes.
So there'd be part of their friends in the Israeli state saying, no, we don't want this to develop, because they don't want any warming of relationships at all between Iran and Britain.
Now that you've brought Israel into it, if you think of the fact that we're talking about sanctions against Russia because it's done bad things about international law, why aren't we talking about sanctions against Israel, which for half a century has ignored the United Nations? Every time it puts a new settlement in the West Bank, it is alienating Arab land and carrying out a policy of imperial creep. And nobody says anything about it. We keep quiet about it. And that's the protection of the Americans.
Many believe that Britain has valued this relationship more than America has. This special relationship has been called into question many times in recent years, with some believing that it never existed.
And where for the centre stage now is the American eye line? Is it moving away from Europe and towards Asia, where obviously the more Navy deployed there and everything? Is the American concern now going to be with China and Japan rather than worrying about Germany and Russia or Britain and NATO?
Well, the next book I want to write is called The Cockpit of the World, and it's where the Russians, the Japanese and the Chinese meet, with little North Korea, troublemaker in the middle, and the Americans on their periphery with their huge fleets. And all the signs so far point to the fact that the Americans are concentrating on the Pacific, building up bases there, expecting and assuming that there's going to be a confrontation with China.
So, Guy, if we can address the cover sheet of your book and the title of your book, American Britain, Was There Ever a Special Relationship? Was there ever a special relationship?
I don't think there was, even at the times when we claim mostly that there was. Churchill, during the war, is supposed to have written something like 35 extremely important letters to Roosevelt. In the archives, you can only find 5 replies from Roosevelt to Churchill. That's an indication. And I think the British wanted a special relationship for the reasons I've given. The Americans were often very cavalier about it and dismissed it, but they resurrected it when there was something like Vietnam. And they worked terribly hard to persuade Wilson to put troops down in Vietnam, and he wouldn't do so. So I think the answer to your question, and the answer I give in my book, is there's a lot of wrangling between us. We had a lot in common, and we both had different objectives which we pursued, but you couldn't really say that there was a special relationship which would always bring us together.
Guy, I found your book absolutely fascinating. I think you do a wonderful analysis of the relationships between America and many of its allies, and thank you for sharing your views with us on the Chronicles.
Well, thank you for asking me.